Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third and final spring webinar in our spring series of Climate Smart webinars. This afternoon, I'm joined by William Fleming and Dr Mary McEvoy to discuss Climate Smart Adapt, our forage options to increase resilience. To begin, I'm just going to introduce Germinal before handing over to Mary and William. So Germinal are 200 years old this year in 2025, and it'll be some party. We've been 150 years as a specialist seed company, and we first walked into the UK market in 1960. As a family-owned business, whilst we celebrate and reflect on our heritage, we are also always looking forward. And this is why we have designed our new range of mixtures to try and help meet the challenges of today and tomorrow for the farmer. We believe that science and detailed trials help us supply the grass and legume mixtures that will help farms meet the climate challenges they face both at a practical farm level and also from legislation and end user perspective. Back in 1986, we formed a long-term connection with IBERs. But in 2021, we took the next step and employed about 15 breeders and technicians from Aberystwyth University. They are now embedded in Aberystwyth University, but work solely for Germinal. This puts us in a much stronger position with more direct input into breeding objectives. As a result of these changes, our Germinal Horizon staff account for 20% of our team working across the 3 Horizon facilities in Aberystwyth, Wiltshire, and New Zealand. So I'm now going to hand over to Mary for the first half of today's webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Harley has said, for anyone who's tuned into the full spring series of webinars, the previous 2 have predominantly focused on emissions reduction, whereas in this webinar, we're going to focus more on adaptation. The greater reduction we see in emissions, the less resilience we will have to build into our systems. But it is critical that we insulate ourselves against external shocks and weather challenges in particular. And I think we're already starting to see, a challenging dry period in a lot of areas at the minute. So what is a resilient farm system? So a resilient farm is designed to withstand and adapt to various shocks and stresses, including climate change, economic instability, and social pressures. And to do this, we need to prioritise robustness within the system, adaptability, and transformability. So in my presentation today, I'm going to focus on forage resilience, and William Fleming, who takes up after me, he's going to look at forage options to support resilience in livestock production systems. So I just want to show you this colour-coded map, and this is updated annually and produced by NASA. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at and displaying, I suppose, how global surface temperature anomalies have occurred over the last 100 odd years or so. Within this diagram, the normal temperatures are shown in white, and these are calculated over a 30-year baseline period. That baseline period is 1951 to 1980. Where we see yellow and red, that's indicating higher than normal temperatures, and the deeper red is +2 degrees above that baseline of average temperatures during the 1951 to 1980 period. If we go to the blue and darker blue, it's showing a lower than normal temperature of up to -2 degrees below that baseline period of 1951 to 1980. So on this graph across the bottom here, you're going to see a timeline which will progress from 1981 up to 2024. So just keep an eye on the year as we look at the change in temperature over time. So we're now going into the early 1900s. Into 1940 now. This is the baseline period of 1951 to 1980. Really interesting to see what happens here when we hit the year 2000. You can see the final frame here, which represents the global temperature anomalies in 2024 compared to that baseline in 1951 to 1980. So it's significantly warmer at almost all parts around the Earth's surface. It has been clear over the last 30 years, it has been warmer than any time previously, and this is going to bring challenges to us going forward. We, as in our generation, may not see the extreme challenges, but the next generation certainly will. Predictions indicate that it will be easier to grow grass. We'll have a longer growing season. Grass growth will kick off earlier in the spring and last longer into the autumn. And I suppose from a livestock production system, that's something that would be a positive. But the reality is this will also be associated with increased summer droughts, and they will become very challenging across a lot of parts of the UK and Ireland. And we're already starting to see those challenges over the last number of years. When we talk about forage resilience, I suppose changing climate is, one of the key drivers that we need to take into consideration. The weather is what we experience on a day-to-day basis. So if I look out the window here today, we have a nice sunny day. The climate is the long-term average of the weather, typically over a 30-year period. In Ireland and the UK, the climate is changing, and temperatures have increased by about 0.7 of a degree Celsius and become about 7% wetter over the period of 1991 to 2020 compared to 1960 to 1990. So, global warming is very much happening. This change is also associated with increased likelihood of intense wet periods, and I think we've seen those over recent years as well. The severity of future climate change will depend on global greenhouse gas emissions and their reductions. And the more warming we experience, the more severe the impacts will be. And that's why it's so important that we focus on trying to reduce emissions from human activities to minimise the effects of global warming. Within forage resilience, soil health is absolutely crucial, and we're all well tuned into the chemical aspect of soil health. We did a webinar back in December focusing on this, so I'm not going to spend too much time today talking about soil health. But if we look at the most recent data which has been published by Teagasc on soils in Ireland, the number of soils which are which are optimised from a pH, P and K perspective are around 17%. That means 83% of our soils are suboptimal, so below what we need for optimal growing conditions for grass. So that's where your pH is not optimised at 6.2 and your P and K index is below that index 3. And just to note, I suppose, for our UK audience, we do measure P and K in the Irish system here, slightly different to how you measure it in the UK. So what we consider an optimum P index or K index of 3, the optimum index in the UK would be 2. So just bear that in mind. But these figures of only 17% of our soils being in optimum conditions for growing grass are fairly consistent with DEFRA data from Northern Ireland and also from some data I've seen in the UK. On top of the chemical aspect of soil health, we also need to focus more on the biological and physical aspects of soil health, because ultimately it's those three legs of the stool as such, which are essential to a healthy soil, and a healthy soil will be much more resilient to challenging weather, be they drought periods or incidences of severe rainfall. Stocking rate is something we need to bear in mind, and that's going to have a huge impact in terms of matching your stocking rate to the ability of the farm to grow grass. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. And also we need to bear in mind, we need to make a plan, have that plan in place, and also allow for a buffer in the system. So, to build up forage stocks to make sure that, if things don't go as expected, we're not running into a tight or a feed deficit too soon. Matching grass growth to stocking rate is absolutely crucial, I suppose, and understanding the farm's potential to grow grass is vital as well. So if we assume about 85% of the grass grown on a farm is utilised, and a dairy cow requires about 5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare of grass and silage to sustain her over a 12-month period, on top of the concentrate being fed, the stocking rate, we need to match it to the ability of the farm to grow grass. So if we look, I suppose, at a farm which is growing about 10.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, realistically, that farm can only carry about 1.7 tonnes or 1.7 cows per hectare to provide sufficient forage to meet the demand of the herd. Outside that, or where the stocking rate increases above that, you're much more dependent on bringing in external inputs such as concentrate or silage from an alternative source. We need to be growing over 14 tonnes of dry matter per hectare to carry a stocking rate of 2.1 cows per hectare. And I suppose increasing grass growth or pasture growth while simultaneously maintaining and reducing chemical nitrogen fertiliser input can only really be achieved by incorporating nitrogen-fixing legumes, such as your white clover in particular, or your red clover is obviously a role to play in silage swords. And William will talk about these in a little bit more detail later on in his presentation. But as it stands, white clover is the only real option that we have that has consistently been shown to add additional value in intensively grazed perennial ryegrass pastures while allowing for a reduction in nitrogen, which is going to be a big challenge facing us going forward. There are other species as well that can be included in terms of your multi-species swards, which have benefits as well, but obviously it's the legumes which are going to fix nitrogen and allow that reduction in nitrogen to be used at farm level. In terms of silage, I suppose it's crucially important that we have a plan and put a plan in place early. We need to calculate your winter feed requirements by doing a fodder budget to determine how much silage you'll need based on your stock type, the numbers of stock you carry, and the expected duration of your winter housing period. There are some very easy to follow calculations or tools available online, and a quick Google will help find these. You need to consider your animal type and age. So in terms of the quality of the diet or the silage you need to make, for dairy cows and milk and growing heifers being offered silage, a DMD of at least 72% will be required. Or for freshly calved winter milk cows, they require silage with a DMD in excess of 75%. As it stands in Ireland, the national average dry matter DMD or dry matter digestibility of silage is around 66%. So that really isn't even sufficient to feed dry cows who need a moderate body condition score gain. So it's really important that we put increased focus on the quality of silage we're making and prioritising the higher quality silage for the stock that's going to get the most benefit from that. In addition to that, I suppose the quantity of silage we make, different animal types will have different silage consumption rates. So for example, an animal who's less than a year old might consume about 0.7 of a tonne of pit silage, while an animal who is over 2 years old might consume 1.3 tonnes of pit silage per month. So it's important to consider the number of animals and the stage that they're at in terms of the requirements that they will have from a silage quality perspective. And critically, we need to measure silage stocks before it's too late. So we need to do this right after the second cut of silage, because at that point in time, if you're seen to be having a deficit on the farm, you have the option to factor in and allow for a third cut. But it's crucial that we do that and do that in time, because the later we leave that to do our winter feed budget and calculate our silage stocks, the less opportunity we have to rectify a problem that's actually there on the farm. In addition to your standard stocks, we also need to factor in a buffer feed. And generally speaking, that's about 1 to 2 months surplus silage beyond your estimated requirements. But depending on the farm, and it's going to be specific to individual farms, that might need to be a little bit more if you're prone to both droughts and maybe an early close period in the winter or the autumn. So having a plan in place and having that buffer is absolutely essential to build resilience into our farm systems. If we look at some work which is from our own research site in Wiltshire, which is German Horizon, it's interesting just to look at the seasonal yield profile of some different sward mixtures. So this is just a quick look at a perennial ryegrass only sward. And it's fair to say that this site would be considered quite a challenging site. It's very, very wet in the winter and very prone to extreme drought, it's probably fair to say, during the summer period. I've been over there at times and you'd be able to put your fist into some of the cracks in the ground, because it dries up and cracks so much. But looking at a typical perennial ryegrass growth curve, which is the green line here, and if we bring a white clover with perennial ryegrass sward in on top of this, you can see that the perennial ryegrass with white clover is outperforming the perennial ryegrass only sward at pretty much all points across the season. In addition, if we have a look at a multi-species sward, the multi-species sward is performing in this trial quite similar to the perennial ryegrass sward in the early part of the season, but thereafter it's performing more similarly in terms of its yield contribution to the perennial ryegrass and white clover. So essentially what we're seeing, adding anything to a perennial ryegrass sward will help in terms of increasing yield stability across the year. And that's, I think, a really important consideration to bear in mind. Looking at the same site and looking at yield profile from different years, and I think if we look at the perennial ryegrass here on the left-hand side of the screen here first, and you can see the years are indicated by your different colour bars. Okay, so 2020 is your light green, 2021, 2022 is your purple, and 2023 is your dark green. Okay. And I suppose it's fair to say that perennial ryegrass and white clover and the multi-species outperformed the perennial ryegrass across all years. I think it's really interesting to look at 2022 here, where there was a severe drought on this site, and the perennial ryegrass only sward only grew 4 tonnes of dry matter per hectare that year. both other treatments outperformed at producing about 50% herbage yield above that of the perennial ryegrass only sward. So again, at all times, we're seeing where we add something to the perennial ryegrass sward, such as white clover, or make a multi-species mixture, we're seeing increased yield stability from those swards. Looking at the same trial site and how swards change over time, and I suppose I'm going to look at this change over both within years and over years. Okay, so this is a multi-species sward which had 6 species, perennial ryegrass and timothy as your 2 grasses, white and red clover as your 2 legumes, and chicory and plantain as your 2 herbs. Okay, so quite a standard 6-way mixture, which we would be quite familiar with here in Ireland and would be also widely used across the UK. You can see for the first cut post sowing in 2020, perennial ryegrass accounted for about 1/3 of the overall composition of the sward, with your herbs accounting for about 50% of the total sward composition. By the end of that year, the legumes had got a little bit stronger, you know, and I suppose, you know, the herbs, the perennial ryegrass and the red clover were the most dominant species at the end of year 1. When we went into the spring of year 2, over 50% of the total herbage was accounted for due to the perennial ryegrass, which is kind of what we would expect. We know some of these legumes and herbs don't do as well as in the spring as your perennial ryegrass. But you can see the plantain holding its own there fairly well, still very consistent with what we would have seen in the first year with the plantain. The chicory has, the contribution of the chicory has got slightly smaller there in the spring of 2021. And as the year progresses towards the end of 2021, your legumes are the most dominant component within the mixture, accounting for almost 50% of the total yield, followed by your perennial ryegrass, which is kind of holding its own there at about 1/3. Okay, into 2022, again, similar to the previous year, perennial ryegrass is dominant in the spring. And, you know, as the year progressed, the legumes, or the clovers, your white and red clover, produced or had a greater contribution to total yield. And just to note here, what we're seeing here in terms of the blue here, it's not actually weeds in the end of 22, it's actually kind of the perennial ryegrass. Because of the severe drought that we saw on this site in 2022, the perennial ryegrass was shedding tillers. So it's almost tiller death of your perennial ryegrass as the plants try to survive as such. And it's also necrotic white clover. When we went into the following year, 2023, after we had, you know, the swards became quite open at the end of 2022 due to that drought. So we saw a higher proportion of weeds in the spring of 2023. The perennial ryegrass accounted for almost 3/4 of the total composition of the sward at this point in time. But, you know, as the season progressed, the weeds reduced in terms of their contribution to the sward. The white clover became more prolific, okay, probably accounting for about 15%, and the perennial ryegrass held its own. So essentially what we see and what we know in terms of where we incorporate different species into the sward, they will contribute at different stages of the year, and that's where we're getting this benefit in terms of increased yield stability in a sward over and above that of the perennial ryegrass only sward. Because at certain points of the year, certain species have the potential to grow more than perennial ryegrass. Whereas the perennial ryegrass obviously does very well in the spring. And I suppose, you know, when we see more challenging conditions, you know, the perennial ryegrass might slow down quicker compared to some other species. Looking at the effect of sward type on dairy cow performance, and this is some work done by Alan Jezaquel at Chagas Curtains, and it's published in Journal of Dairy Science there in 2024. But he compared a perennial ryegrass sward with 250 kilos of nitrogen to a perennial ryegrass and white clover sward at 125 kilos of nitrogen, or a multi-species sward, which is again that 6-way multi-species, also at 125 kilos of nitrogen. Okay, the total herbage yield of the perennial ryegrass at 250 kilos of nitrogen was quite similar to that of the multi-species at 125 kilos of nitrogen. There's no significant difference between those two figures there. The white clover was lower in terms of its production, about a ton lower than that of the perennial ryegrass sward, perennial ryegrass only sward. However, there was no difference in terms of milk output per hectare or milk solids output per hectare across these. And we need to consider, I suppose, also that the pasture yield and nutrient value was relatively similar across the treatments, despite 2 of the treatments being the perennial ryegrass with white clover and the multi-species receiving 125 kilos less nitrogen across the year compared to the perennial ryegrass only sward. Looking at some red clover trial work, which is also happening at Teagasc, and I suppose just want to quickly touch on this. This is work by Sinead Carney, where grass, and this is a zero nitrogen treatment, where the grass is represented by the light green line, and the grass is producing 6.1 tonnes of dry matter per hectare in this zero nitrogen treatment. Adding clover or red clover to the sward gave an increase in all cases. And we see an increase from about 5 tonnes increase for the lowest performing variety to almost 9 tonnes increase for Aberclarage, which is highest performing variety in this trial. Okay, so there's potential of red clover with grass to yield 15 tonnes under a zero nitrogen system. But I suppose variety choice is critically important here, because there is a big range between the best and worst variety in this trial. Another thing I think we need to just keep in mind as we face, these milder, damper winters in particular, or milder winters in particular, and I suppose damper autumns, is the increased incidence we're likely to see with grassland pests and diseases. Okay, I'm not going to spend any time going through these, but it's fair to say that fruit fly, leatherjacket, wireworms, and slugs are the most common grassland pests that we do see. And they have been creating greater problems, I think, in recent years compared to what we would have seen historically with them. The wireworms in Ireland might have been historically more associated with cereal crops, but they are definitely starting to present problems in grassland systems as well. And I think in the UK, you'd be a lot more familiar with the wireworm maybe than we are here in terms of grass-based systems, at least. This is just a quick picture of a sward that I went to see this spring, which had severe leatherjacket damage. This hadn't been an issue in this field before, and this field was sown a couple of years, so it was a well-established sward. But again, just severe damage being caused by leatherjackets, and we're likely to see more of that going forward. In terms of grassland diseases, and again, I suppose no different to ourselves, when we're under stress, we're more susceptible to catching a cold or catching the flu maybe. When grasses are exposed to higher temperatures, they're also, that's increasing the stress placed on the plant. And as a result, the grass plant is also then more susceptible to an increase in terms of diseases, or an increased risk of diseases. And on top of that, the progression of those diseases can speed up. Damp and humid conditions also encourage buildup of disease, and also where we're carrying heavy covers. So it is likely that we will see a lot more incidence of grassland diseases going forward. And it's not just grasses, I suppose clovers are also susceptible to some of these. So it is just something worth keeping in mind and bearing in mind. Through grass and clover breeding programs, there is intensive selection for varieties that are resistant to diseases, to try reduce the risk of farmers being exposed. So it is a key focus of grassland and clover breeding programs. Healthy soils, good grassland management, and adequate nitrogen fertilization will help minimise the risk. So essentially, where we try to support the grass plant and keep it as healthy as we can, it's much more or much better able to tolerate and resist disease in the first instance. Just to summarise, it is absolutely crucial that we build resilience into our systems to avoid potential shocks as they occur, and I suppose ultimately that we're prepared for those shocks. So we are more likely to have droughts during the summer, and we need to work that or factor that into our planning in terms of our forage-based systems going forward. It's essential that we have efficient forage to allow for the unexpected. This is going to be farm specific. Some farms are more at risk of drought, others will be more at risk of an extended indoor period associated with an early or a long winter. And essentially you need to put a plan in place to ensure sufficient forage to meet your own requirements on your farm, taking into account your stocking rate and the classes of stock that you're carrying, and also create a buffer within the system. So, as I said already, having, 1 to 2 months surplus requirement beyond what you expect to need just puts a bit of resilience into the system. There are forage options, and William is going to talk about these in his presentation, which can support an increase in terms of the seasonality of supply. But, I think it's important just to keep in mind that nothing is absolutely drought resistant. If we go into a severe drought, most of the species that have a value in terms of livestock production systems will start to slow down in terms of their production. And homegrown protein is crucially, will become more important, I suppose, going forward. We can grow, high quality red clover silage swords with very low or even no nitrogen inputs, and it's something worth considering going forward. So I want to thank you very much. I can take any quick questions, Harley, when I'm stopping sharing my my presentation here, if you have them.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Mary. We've had a question come in. It's around the utilisation on the dairy farms. You mentioned it being about 80%. Would you suggest or say that would be the same utilisation rate for sort of beef and sheep farms?
Yeah, so look, I mean, we'd always target kind of 85% utilization over the grass that we're producing, I suppose. So it's probably fairly similar for well-managed beef and sheep farms. It might be a little bit lower. What's interesting to note, I suppose, Harley, is the total grass production that we see of beef and sheep versus dairy farms in terms of the total grass utilization. So on average, here in Ireland, we're only utilizing probably just over 8 tons of dry matter per hectare on average on your dairy farm. And over just around 5.6 tons is being utilised on your beef and sheep farm. So look, they're generally associated with slightly lower stocking rates. They're not really pushing the system as much. You know, there's not as much pressure on them to grow forage. So, you know, the utilisation of the grass being grown on the farm is probably similar, but there's less pressure maybe in a beef or sheep system to grow that quantity of grass.
Brilliant. Thank you, William. Over to you when you're ready.
Thanks, Harley. Mary has highlighted the challenges that we are all facing with the climate and the changing weather patterns, and that is one of the main driving factors and what drove us to think about this and design the adapt section within the climate smart mixes. And hopefully I'll give some specific species and where they fit in, along with a couple of other strategies as well. So we'll start with what is the common other grass that we add in mixes. It is Timothy. It is a small seed. It is very, very persistent. It doesn't mind its feet wet. So from Harley's results there, when a quarter of the people, I think it was, suffered from drought, from flooding, sorry. Timothy is a very useful plant to have in those situations, and it grows at a lower soil temperature than perennial ryegrass. So it's there, it's adding kilos of dry matter at the shoulders of the season when we've got a struggle. But it's not that great for summer dry periods, as we're currently experiencing even in deepest, darkest Scotland at the moment. The next one to speak about is cocksfoot. Now, when I was a boy at school, which is not just yesterday, cocksfoot was in all the grass mixes on my father's farm. It was everywhere. But the problem with it is palatability. It's a great grass. It doesn't mind its wet feet. It can stand this dry weather. But to get the best out of it, you have to graze it very hard and keep the leaves on it short and young and leafy. Because as the leaves mature and get a bit bigger, they get these fine silica hairs on them, which stock don't like to eat, and it jags them out and they reject it. So you have to keep it grazed really tightly down. Now, one of the other problems about cocksfoot is that it exudates which prohibit other species growth, and that tends to be clover is one that we see that with quite a bit. So it's one to think about and think about where you want to utilise it, but it needs careful thought before you just go putting it into mixes. Now, the next one, and it's one that we do use quite a lot of, is fescues, particularly meadow fescues and sheep's fescues. But there are over 300 species of fescue in the Festuca family, right from the top there, which is a picture of a meadow fescue, to the bottom one, which is one of the specific amenity varieties that we use for lawns and for golf courses, etc. So there's a huge range, and you need to know what you're using to make it worthwhile. The agricultural ones, the meadow fescues, the tall fescues, sheep's fescues, they're lower yielding than perennial ryegrass, but they still have a reasonable digestibility and therefore ME. Now, Fesculoliums. Fesculolium is a cross between any fescue and any ryegrass. And as you saw from the last slide, there are 300 species of fescue. And for that reason, it can be a very confusing species of grass. You really need to know the parentage of a Fesculolium to know where it's going to fit into your system and how it's going to work on farm. We have two in our portfolio, and they are complete opposite grasses. They are very, very different. Both very useful, but both very different. We've Aberniche, which is a meadow fescue crossed with an Italian ryegrass. So we have the deeper rooting element from the fescue, and we have the yield and the quality from the Italian ryegrass. But this will only last you 3-4 years Aberniche, and then it will start to run out of steam. The newer one, Aberroot, which actually is a Festuloleum, but it has also got onto the English and Welsh recommended list as an intermediate tetraploid on its own merits. So it is a cross between an Atlas fescue come from the Atlas Mountains in North Africa, very, very dry area, and a perennial ryegrass. So we have that deeper rooting element of the Aberroot, but we also have the quality and the yield from the perennial ryegrass in it, and I'll show you some more detail on that in a minute. But this is work that we've carried out at Germinal Horizon Wiltshire between 2019 and 2022. It was looking at the quality element and how breeding over time has changed what we regard as the D values for the different species. Just to say, for those of you in England and Wales who look at the recommended list, that perennial ryegrass figure looks a bit lower, but basically what we did was we took 4 varieties at random from the recommended list. So we've just taken an average of those. But there you see the quality element of the Festuloleum, very, very close behind the D value of the perennial ryegrass. It's only about 0.4 of a D value point lower than perennial ryegrass. So that brings a big benefit for these deeper rooting Festuloleums in terms of the quality that they bring to the diet. We look at some of the other ones, our fescues there, our tall fescues and our Timothys, a lot lower D value. So we're not producing the same amount of energy per hectare to feed stock and drive production. Now, after we got Aberroot onto the recommended list, we took it to an on-farm trial, which was conducted by our colleagues at Germinal Horizon Wiltshire, and they took this onto a very drought-prone farm. It's almost like trying to grow grass and milk cows on a sandy beach, to review the potential that the Aberroot has as a Festuloleum, and it was done over 3 grazing seasons: 2021, the really dry year of 2022 that Mary highlighted earlier, and also 2023. Now, this slide shows you the potential in terms of the yield that you're getting from Aberroot, but the yield, this doesn't tell you the distribution of growth throughout the season. The Aberroot hangs on longer into the dry period and keeps producing kilos of dry matter to feed stock longer when you get a dry period after the traditional perennial ryegrasses stop producing dry matter. But the interesting factor is it's very, very close in yield to the perennial ryegrass and a long way in front of what we consider to be our other drought-tolerant species, our cocksfoots and our tall fescues. Just want to highlight one thing for those that are joining from Ireland. We have access to Aberroot in the UK, but it's currently still going through its recommended list testing in Ireland, and it'll be a couple of years before it's available commercially in Ireland. Moving on to the clovers, one of the stress-tolerant clovers now that is double root, a variety called Aberlasting. Now this is a world first because it was very, very difficult to create that cross and that hybridization between our traditional white clovers and a Caucasian clover. But what it has done, it has shows exceptional drought tolerance and exceptional tolerance to extremes of weather, be that drought or cold, and it's also very, very grazing tolerant. It has, as it says by the name, double root. White clovers traditionally are stolons along the surface, but double root also has rhizomes that grow below the surface of the soil, and that aids in its tolerance to these extremes of climate. Our temperate, generally speaking, temperate climate in UK and Ireland we don't get the extremes of hot, cold, dry weather that other parts of the world do. So this new variety that's been used, Aberlasting, which is hopefully the first of a series of these, we don't see the full potential of it here in the UK and Ireland. It's only when you go to places like Japan, where they have very cold and very warm, or Argentina, where it's very dry, that you see the true potential. But it is another excellent addition to our armoury in fighting these changes that we have. Moving on to the two major herbs that we include in multi-species and in the adapt range. The first of these is plantain. I want to talk about. I think plantain's a fantastic addition to the sward. It produces a lot of dry matter. It brings extra kilos of dry matter, and it also has a slightly different amino acid profile to grass and white clover. So it's an excellent complement to grazing livestock and supports really high live weight gains on grazing stock. And it also tolerates the dry weather because it has a big ball root which goes far deeper and can scavenge moisture in the soil better than traditional perennial ryegrasses and clovers. That support of live weight gain that we mentioned, this is a summary of 4 different pieces of trial work that was done a number of years ago to show the benefits of plantain grazing on grazing lambs. And you can see there it's between 10 and 34% better weaning weights on lambs on grass and plantain as it is on just grass alone. The other major herb that we utilise for drought tolerance is chicory. Now, chicory is a really deep taproot, so again, it can scavenge moisture in a dry period, and it really grows exceptionally well during these dry periods in time. It continues to produce a lot of kilograms of dry matter to feed stock, and it also helps with growth rates. But the big one for chicory in particular is its anthelmintic properties, and it has been shown both in work here that's been done at Newton Rig a number of years ago, and more recently work on multi-species with a 6-species mix that was conducted in Ireland. They were finding the same thing, that we were getting reductions in the fecal egg count of the lambs that were grazing swards where chicory was one of the major elements of it. And it appears that the leaf architecture of the chicory plant is one of the significant things that helps with that. The worms don't have a nice, the hairiness of the back of the chicory leaf. The worm larvae aren't able to migrate up the chicory leaf the same as they can do up a shiny perennial ryegrass one. But also, just as an aside to this, one of the really interesting factors that we found was that the mothers of these lambs, when they were grazing and nursing on a grass and chicory sward, at the end of the 41-day trial period, they had maintained their body condition score far better than the ewes that were just nursing on grass alone. So that extra nutrition and different balance to the nutrition was helping the ewes maintain condition, which is useful for later in the season. Now, we've talked about these properties, but what do they actually bring in terms of their nutrition to the table? Well, this was work this is extrapolated from the multi-species work that Mary mentioned from Germinal, Horizon, Wiltshire. And here we're seeing that the energy density of the chicory is just below 11 ME across the year, and the plantain is just over 11 ME. So these factors and figures are not insignificant in terms of the diet for grazing livestock. The other element of them is the crude protein of it. Now, we were struggling to get similar results to what some of published literature was for both the chicory and the plantain. The chicory literature indicated that on the leaf material above 20 centimetres, you could almost be at nearly 30% crude protein. And as you come down the leaf, the crude protein gets lower. But because of the method of harvesting and the trial work to get a standardisation, it was all cut at 5 centimetres. So that's perhaps why we were struggling to get chicory with the higher protein that is suggested in some of the published literature. But similarly, we struggled to get crude protein levels at the Wiltshire site to match the crude protein levels on the published literature. Literature was saying it could be anywhere between 16 and 28% crude protein. We were tending to be at the lower level of that, and this is something, an area that we're continuing to investigate as we move forward. Now, when we're talking about overcoming these challenging periods, having a summer brassica is not something that everybody thinks about, but they are a useful addition into the forage budget, particularly if you know you're going to suffer for a dry period. We have these short-term brassicas that you can put in, stubble turnips, red starch, leafy turnips like Appin that you can sow, and they'll be ready to graze 6 to 8 weeks after you've planted them. But remember, if you're grazing dairy cows on them, the maximum inclusion of the brassica is 30%. As we say there, the problem is we don't know when a dry period is going to appear. This year it has came very early. Other years like 2022, it was into the middle of June through July and into August when we really suffered. But the inclusion of the brassica is a way to allow you to build up either a wedge of grazing or take extra fields to make bales and give yourself that buffer that Mary was talking about in terms of silage. So hopefully we've covered some of the options for building resilience into your forage systems, either, as Mary was mentioning earlier, that reserve of silage, utilising a summer brassica, or incorporating some of these other species into the mix that can help with the stress periods, but it also builds on the base that we have across all of our mixes, high quality aber high sugar grasses. Today we have focused mainly on the grass species and a quick word or two about the major herbs, but in our previous capture webinar we looked at the element and the potential that legumes can play in this as well, to this drive towards productive sustainability, and that webinar is available to watch again on our website. So thank you very much for your attention, and if Harley's got any questions, we'll go from there.
Brilliant, thank you, William. Yeah, thank you to everybody that sent in some questions. I've picked a couple out here that I think are poignant to today. William, if I can come to you first, please. How much are you suggesting that we should really include as multi-species on your grazing platform or your grazing area?
I think that's the challenge is managing the multi-species grazing lays. Particularly the chicory element can be more difficult to manage. So I would say around about 20% of the grazing platform and multi-species, and that way it allows you to have an infield buffer, but maintains the high quality perennial ryegrass and white clover for the rest of your grazing platform.
Brilliant, thank you. And coming to you, Mary, on the back of the multi-species slides you were showing, they were compiling sort of 2 grasses, 2 herbs, and 2 legumes. Is that the optimum mix for farmers to be putting out, or do we need to diversify from that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work done, I suppose, Harley, at more diverse mixes as well, where you kind of go up to, 9, 12 and 15 or 16 variety or species in a mixture. And it always really comes back to those 1 or 2 grasses, your two legumes and 2 herbs being those which are having the greatest contribution to yield and the greatest benefits as well. And even at Germinal Horizon, we've done some work looking at other herbs and legumes within the mixture, and what we've really seen is they're failing to really establish, so you're not seeing the contribution from them in the sward. So that 6-way mix seems to be the optimum, and a lot of the work from other sites, maybe UCD or Johnson Castle, would back that up as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, William, before we let everybody go, your plantain and chicory trials you were discussing, What sort of inclusion rates of those herbs would you be looking to put in a lay or a reseed?
Where they are being incorporated with a grass and white clover lay, I would go with a maximum of about 0.8 of a kilogram of either into the mix, but it very much depends on what else is in the species. The more species you have, the more you have to tweak your ratios of these different species. I know if you go to New Zealand, we have certain pure stands of plantain being grown, but that's not something that we see, certainly not in the UK. Currently, we incorporate it with a grass and clover lay to have a long-term benefit there.
Yeah, they would have a lot of different chemistry as well, wouldn't they, for these things, which would help.
If I can just add to that, Harley, just for
Please.
the Irish audience perspective, in terms of there is a scheme being provided at the moment from the Department of Agriculture, which is subsidising the establishment of multi-species forwards. It is a specific mixture that farmers have to sow. So if anyone is looking at the multi-species, it is a specific mixture if they're applying for that subsidy, which the department have in place at the moment. The deadline for the application is actually tomorrow, as I look at the calendar here. So you know, anyone thinking of doing it, you want to get to it tonight.
Lovely, that's great. Well, thank you very much both for your time and the presentations and the questions. And thank you to all of you at home for joining. I hope you found that useful. As Williams alluded to earlier, all of these webinars are recorded and on our Knowledge Hub on our website, so are available for further sort of investigation. But again, if you feel free to contact any of us directly also, and we can help where possible. But again, just say thank you all for joining and have a good afternoon.